Right, welcome everybody. So this is going to be all about kind of visual patterns and anti-patterns. And I know as coders, you kind of understand patterns and anti-patterns in your code. So this should be a nice, easy way for you to see the patterns and anti-patterns when you're trying to communicate things using diagrams and other visuals. So I had a nice introduction there, but I am a principal consultant. I go into businesses and I do consulting on lots of different things to do with architecture, and I run workshops on software architecture, communication, and that kind of thing. So you can find me in all these places if you want to. But today we're going to talk about actual effective communication. It's not just someone saying, you need to make this diagram. It's us actually thinking about how we want to communicate what we want to communicate. And as I said, we're going to have a look at this with some patterns and anti-patterns. So you can see we've got the ticks and the crosses. Nice simple way to be able to see these things. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and avoid these pitfalls that are very easy to fall into. Now, there was a really good diagram shown yesterday on the screen, which got a really good laugh, which was just this huge diagram of lots and lots of boxes and lines. We want to try and avoid those kinds of things. So the first thing I want to talk about today is the fact that style actually communicates. Now, if you look at these two diagrams, they're exactly the same, apart from the style. And what we can do is we can use style to visually communicate to your audience. So this one, if you showed this kind of style diagram to your stakeholders at the beginning of a project, they might kind of say, oh, when does testing start? And you think, oh, wait a minute, this is just an idea. We haven't even started building this yet. If you showed them this version, they might not get that idea. But if you show them this kind of version later on in that project, they might start thinking that things aren't as far along as you say they are. So something to think about there. And this pattern I like to call meta style, because it's a bit like metadata. It's the subconscious messages that you are passing to people when you give them a diagram of any form. So what you want to do is you actually want to use your style to your advantage and think, what do I want people to think when they see this diagram? And you want to avoid that miscommunication of making them think something that you didn't actually intend. So I hope you've had some coffee because you're going to have some interaction in this talk. Sorry. Which of these styles is correct? So this diagram is a data flow diagram. It's level 2. It's quite detailed. You put your hands up if you would go for the sketchy style number 1. Okay, and number 2. Okay, pretty much everybody's saying number 2. Now, I'm going to go and say it depends, because it always does. So number 2, yes, you're thinking, okay, this is detailed. We've been thinking about this. But what if it's just the original kind of idea? It's like, oh, we think this is what's going to be. Or maybe your actual company says, you've got to use this sketch style, in which case it's number 1. It always depends. Right, I've got another pattern for you now. This one is called face in the crowd, which I'm looking at now. But this is also known as know your audience. And this is the kind of thing that we tend to think about this. So different audiences are going to need different layers of kind of detail, different information. And we kind of all sit there and go, yes, of course. But very often we don't think about this when we're actually creating our diagrams. And so you need to really think, who is this diagram for? What am I communicating to these people? You don't just think, oh, I'm going to give them a overview context diagram. You need to actually think about who they are and what they want to know. So there's a few things you can think about here. We've got, what's their technical understanding? So are you creating something for developers, architects? Is it a product owner who doesn't really care about the technology you've chosen, but really cares about how it meets the needs of their product? So think about what you're trying to communicate. Then there's what level of detail do they need? Are you giving an awful lot of implementation detail to a team that's going to implement it? Or do they actually make a lot of those decisions themselves? Are you presenting to like an architecture review board? What kind of detail do they actually want? Do they want really high level? Do they want a lot of detail? You also then need to think, what do they want from you? And sometimes you're going to have to work this out because they probably don't actually know. But you need to think, well, what are they wanting from me so I can keep them happy? What have they asked for? What does this type of stakeholder normally want? And then the last one here, which we normally forget about, is what do you actually want from them? Do you need them to sign off on a decision based on what you're showing them? Or do you need them to actually make a decision? Are they going to have that information to be able to make that decision? So they may not know they need this, but you need to work it out. It's quite a hard job being working in technology, isn't it? You've got to kind of work out what everybody wants as well as what they want to ask for. So again, you've got to have a think about this. This is a class diagram. Who would need a class diagram like this? Just call out.
Nobody.
Okay, call nobody. The amount of times I give this talk and somebody says nobody because it's UML. Yeah, very good. It's fine, there's always one. So, yes, either nobody, because it's UML and nobody wants UML, but this is kind of going to be more the sort of technical lines, people who are working with the database or the code. This one is a context diagram, so very high level. This one is C4, could just be boxes and lines though. So who's this for? Business? Architects?
Everybody.
Everybody, yes. This is for everybody. Even those people who are down in the code should understand the context of what they're working on. So, nice, useful one for everybody. Right, I've got another anti-pattern for you now. This one I call multi-story diagram, also known as mixing levels of abstraction. Now, you probably have heard of this as a bit of a sin in coding. And what we do in coding is we tend to break things out, either into things like services, modules, or maybe we have a layered architecture. So there's a couple of examples here of different ways that we break things up. We also can do this in architecture. So I mentioned the C4 model, which has these different layers, these different levels. So we looked at the context one. There's also container, component, and code. You tend to only use the top two, but this is breaking it out into these different levels of abstraction. You then get some frameworks that do this as well. And SABSA, which is a security framework, is one of them. And it's just breaking this out into different kind of ways of looking at things. And when we have a diagram where we have different we have things in that diagram that are on different levels of abstraction, we get a problem like with, let's see if I can find it, here we go. So this dark blue box is on a different level of abstraction to all the other things that it's kind of connecting to. And it's confusing when one level of an arrow is kind of on a different level of abstraction to the other, because we don't know what is really connecting to each other. And so what we do is we break these out. So we have this context level, which is the one that we saw earlier, and then we have this next level down, which is the container diagram. And so that dark blue box on the previous diagram has now become this dotted line that you can see all around the outside. And so we've broken it down into the different things. And so the big message here is that mixing those levels of abstraction can cause confusion. Now, this one is normally people's favourite. You can probably tell from the title. So this one's called Explosion of Unicorns, or also known as Too Many Colours. And now, just a little bit of health and safety. I need to... I get exposed to this all the time. So, you might end up with diagrams like this, where yes, it's quite bright and there's just so many colours, but they don't actually mean anything. Someone's just gone, oh, all of these are different things. I'm going to pick a different colour for each one. And you may as well actually just put this in front of people, because it's rather overwhelming and rather confusing. And so there's a few things here that you can do. So the first one of these, I can take these off again now. The first one of these is that you can actually minimize your color palette. So you don't need a different color for every single thing, even if there aren't that many things in there. So here we go. I've reduced it down. I've even, put in a key at the bottom there. That's one I'm not going to cover today, but a good one to think about. And so I've actually used it to group, and I've used it to actually communicate something. So that's the second thing. Actually use colour to aid communication. If you're not communicating anything with colour, you're just going to confuse people, because we try and look for patterns. And if it doesn't mean anything, we'll be spending that precious mental resource trying to work out what it does mean. So you can actually just use one colour all the way through, or just shock horror, no colour. Use black and white. That could be really useful, because then when you want to highlight something, you put one colour in, it's really obvious what you're highlighting. So that was one thing to do with colour. Now here's another one. Now this one is, I call colour is key, also known as relying on colour to communicate. Now, a lot of people end up doing this, but you've got to do some more work now, sorry. This is simulated protanopia, which is one of the different types of colour blindness. Only one of these is actually yellow. And I want you to tell me which one of them is yellow. So put your hand up if you think A is yellow. B, C, and D. Most people going for D. Correct. Now, I've reshuffled them round. This is simulated tritanopia. Now, which one of these is yellow? Is it E, F, G, H? A lot of you didn't even put your hand up. But in this case, it was actually E. And when we compare these, we can see that it's not just a case of, oh, okay, avoid red and green, because there are actually an awful lot of different types of colour blindness. And when you are helping someone with one form of colour blindness, you might actually be making it harder for someone else. So there are all these different types here. And so some people can't see very much of a colour, some people can't see a colour at all, and there are a very few people in the world who actually can't see colour at all, which is called achromatopsia. And it's actually about 4.5% of the world's population, which kind of doesn't sound that much, but when we're talking about inclusion, we are talking about everybody, whether it's 1% or 50% of people. And it's actually 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. So if you think about the tech industry and this room, you've got a lot more men. So you're actually more likely in the tech industry, at least at the moment, hopefully it will change, to run into someone who is colourblind. And it's actually more than 350 million people worldwide. That sounds a lot more than 4.5%, doesn't it? That's actually more than the total population of the US. It's about half the population of Europe in total in the world. And there are lots of tools that we can use to help us with this. So if you are doing web development, there are inbuilt tools in things like Chrome in its dev tools and Firefox. You can also install various different things into the browsers to help you with this, so you can test your user interfaces. You can also use these just on any computer. There are free ones around. My particular favourite on my Mac is one called Sim Daltonism, which is really useful because it's got just a window you can drag over stuff. Really, really easy. So if you've got a palette, any palette, you can then have a look and see, here's my standard palette. I want to check all these different types. And you can see here that these two colours are really very similar. And there's one easy way to sort this out, and that is just to get rid of one of those colours, because you probably don't need, if you've got a palette of, say, 8 to 10 colours, you probably don't need them all anyway. The other way to do it is to just tweak how light or dark the saturation of that colour, and then check it again. So the one thing we can do is use a colourblind simulator. And if you don't have time to do anything else, check your colours in grayscale. If you can tell the difference in grayscale, then you are likely onto a winner. But you do want to try and check them if possible, especially if this is a palette you're going to be using a lot of the time. Now, I talked about using a key here. This looks really nice and easy to work out unless you put it in grayscale. Then they look identical to everyone's. Now, I wrote a book and the paper copy is all in grayscale. So you can imagine I had great fun going through every single diagram, working out what colours I could use in there. So one of those things that you can use is pattern. So this whole thing is about don't rely on colour alone. So you can use your simulators, but there are other things you can do as well. So pattern is one of those things. You just need to make sure that the contrast is okay. You can use symbols. I've been using ticks and crosses throughout this whole thing. I could use colour with them as well. Didn't need to. But the big thing is don't rely on colour alone. Use those symbols, use labels, anything, not just colour. Right. I call this pattern MLAH, which also known as multiple letter acronym hell. This is quite a good one as well. But the key thing here is to only use defined acronyms. Now, you can do this in a few different ways. If you're speaking to people, you can say the acronym and the definition. So you can say AKA, also known as, and that gives people the chance to learn. Whereas if you just use one or the other, they don't get that chance to learn. If you're writing things, it will depend on how long that piece of written work is. So if it's just a blog post, you probably just need to define it once at the beginning. If it's a bigger form of work like documentation, you probably want to be using things like a glossary. If you are using them in diagrams, put them in the key. If you're trying to save that space in the diagram, please put them all in the key, which is inside the diagram, not next to it, because we all know that the diagram will get sent off to somebody who will not then have the key. So, a bit more of your brain power is needed. Dry, what does that stand for?
Don't
repeat yourself, you just did.
I didn't know.
Right. DFD. Clue, I talked about it. The last one's diagram.
Yes, what?
Data flow diagram, well done. SPA,
Again,
single page application. BLT,
just as the same.
make less than smarter. Yes. Or is it business leadership team? Or basic language translator? Or bulk loading tool? Or just be like that? You kind of get my point. It could be a lot of different things. Acronyms can mean different things to different people. You get people in different countries. You get someone who's just watched Netflix and so understands an acronym differently. It can be really different just in one room. So it's really easy to fall into thinking that others have the same understanding as you. We all have some kind of idea of how the world works in our head, but everyone else has a different one. So need to consider that. So next time you use an acronym, think SIDI, which is state it, define it. Now, I'm being silly, yes, but I just did do that. So I followed it. Right, one last one for today. I could go on all day about this. In fact, I worked out that the first part of my book, it takes more than a day. This one is called Connect the Dots, also known as representational consistency. So when we're navigating between these different diagrams, we need to be able to do that easily. So I've just told you, don't have one diagram, split it up. And there are lots of reasons for doing that. But we need to be able to navigate between those easily then, because we've got more than one diagram to look at. And so we've seen this one. We've got the C4 levels. We've got that dark blue box on the top level, which then becomes that dotted box on the next. And whichever one of these diagrams you see first, you can then work it out with the other diagram. When we're looking at some data flow diagrams, we can do something similar, but with referencing. So in this top level, we have the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And then in the second level, we have the 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. And so we can easily make that link. We also have this reference to the different data stores. So please, please, please make sure the references do actually match up across your diagrams. This is going to make it so easy for people to look at one diagram and then have an understanding of where they are when they get into another diagram. So what you are looking to do is you're looking to make those explicit references to the other levels of abstraction that you have created. Now, as I said, I would love to go on and on about this today and just hopefully not bore you with things. But if you want to find out more, then you can find out more on the book's website. And I'm going to be doing the office hours after this, and I will have a small number of codes to give away to people so you can read the book free for 30 days as well. So I want to say thank you very much. And if you would like to come and talk to me about any of the things that I do, then please come and have a chat. So thank you.